The survey was a survey that I wrote to evaluate morale on athletic teams, actually. I was doing interviews and I wasn't getting the information I needed from 1 hour interviews with each member of a team. This was at Indiana University working with athletes and teams. And I decided there must be a better way to get people to feel safe and tell me the truth about why they're unhappy about being on the swim team or whatever team it was. And I wrote this survey that turned into basically very much like a clinical interview, meaning I'm asking how do you feel and why do you feel that way in sequence. I'm also asking about intensity and valence of those feelings so that I can aggregate the responses. But that sequence of how do you feel and why do you feel that way is distinctive, I think. I don't think most of the time we ask a feel question first. How do you feel? Allows people then to think, to consult themselves and come back with an understanding of what are the emotions they're experiencing when they're on a team or as part of a group. And that kind of gives us a perspective on the issues driving those feelings. It's a little different. If you start by asking about how people feel, they typically have a hard time. I'm sorry, if you ask them why they feel the way they do about their work or tell me something rational about the workplace, it's harder for them to do that than if you start with emotions. And they can identify emotions very quickly, and then they can back into the issues that are driving those emotions. So that's basically how this thing gets to those important insights. And the another unique feature of this survey is that we believe that I've come to learn that, of course, everyone comes to work every day with an expectation of how the world is supposed to feel and how the workplace is supposed to feel. So we have an ideal in our brains and our minds of how the world should feel. And we hope then as we walk into work every day that our ideal expectations are going to be met to some degree. We really would like them, all of our expectations to be met, and we could have an ideal work experience. But what's typical, of course, is we're missing the mark in the workplace, and people come and they have less than ideal experiences. And the Clarity Survey gets to these issues by starting with the emotion. It's an emotion-driven approach avoidance tendency that we all have for anything. And when the stimulus shows up and you walk into your workplace, you feel those emotions, and then you have the thoughts attached to them, and that then results in behaviors. Clarity Survey gets to these in that same sequence with emotions first, thoughts second, and then we can predict and discuss what the behaviors might be, and we can measure those, of course, much more effectively. Traditional research starts with thoughts and very seldom really gets into the emotions that people feel. And of course, as we think about diversity and inclusion in a workplace, these are very much emotional issues that people experience. And there's a rational explanation behind those feelings, but it's the feelings that make people unhappy and discouraged and feeling discriminated against is very much an emotional experience. The next slide then. One of the real important pieces of this survey strategy is this understanding of the ideal. And what we've learned is that for most people, change is very hard. And the goal of an employer, the goal of an employer is to take the person who walks in the door as a new hire and really change their feelings. Now they're coming with an expectation of, let's try this out. I got a new job. I sure hope it works out well. And you'd like to change those feelings and thoughts to affirmative commitment. Yes, I am in the right place. This is a great place for me to work. And I will be more loyal, of course, if I feel that kind of positive feeling about being in the workplace. So the goal here is to create a workplace that convinces your employees that this is the right place for them. And this is an active process. It can't be just a one-time thing. Of course, it's a day-to-day experience that they have as they work in this culture. So what we know is that in most cases, we don't like to change. And we're asking this employee to change his attitude, change his or her attitude about the work and the company from a wait and see to a commitment. But we typically hang on to our expectations and our beliefs and feelings, and we tend to repeat those into the future. Now, what we have learned as well in brain science is that when we do that, and we can move to the next slide. This is a schematic of our typical choice, our decision process when we're making a decision day to day on everyday behaviors. We have emotions that come into the frontal cortex. The lateral prefrontal cortex is LPC, and that tends to light up when we're making decisions about what to do next and how we feel in our attitudes. And they're driven by emotions and cognitions, and our attitudes and behaviors result from those inputs. Now, what we can predict day to day is that we have the same attitudes and feelings about a workplace, unless there's some significant reason to change those attitudes and behaviors. And the significant input required here to change somebody's behavior and their attitudes, turns out we have this frontal polar cortex, and we can move on to the next slide. Frontal polar cortex is not usually part of the decision process when we make choices about behavior. What we've done in the past, we repeat, unless the frontal polar cortex is activated, and it's only activated when we come up against something that is really distinctive and very powerfully positive for us. It's like a big benefit shows up in the world, and that ignites this frontal polar cortex. It's activated, and it's like, oh my goodness, here's a great new thing, and I can now I'm freed from repetition to try new behaviors to approach this ideal. And as you can present an ideal condition in the workplace, something that's really positive, then people can change their attitudes and move more positively toward their thoughts about the company and working there. But it has to be a big benefit. You can't do this halfway and convince people that you're a great place to work and engage people and get them committed. So overall, the ideal is very, very powerful in business. You can move customers around by understanding ideals, and you can move employees' attitudes around by understanding what they really want. So that's the first piece in our survey, is tell us, how should this job feel? If this job were as good as it could be, how would you feel and think about it? So that's the first part of the survey, the Clarity survey, is let's understand ideal and what people's expectations are for the workplace. And the next slide then. After we have the ideal expectations, we can then, and we do, the next sequence of questions in this short survey, after we gather information about ideal, the next question is about how does it feel to be at work day to day? What are you experiencing? What are your feelings? And why do you feel those feelings when you're at work? And so we have gathered then ideal and real, and we can create very visual comparisons of the profiles of what people want ideally and what they're getting from their day-to-day work. And we can move on to the next slide. Wanted to share with you an example of how this plays out. This is a company we did some work for a couple of years ago, and I've genericized this, but it's pretty typical of many companies that we've worked with. In this case, say employee benefits company, and they were having difficulty attracting and retaining new employees. The company had a core of older male employees, and although they had opportunities to grow, the company was being held back by consistent attrition. So they'd hire folks and train them and then lose them within 6 months or a year. And there was just a revolving door here at this company. And we came along and did our baseline survey for them. And then we came back a year later to evaluate how their interventions had played out. Had they been able to move the dial in the right direction 12 months later. So next slide. What comes out of this survey very directly are prioritized lists of the issues that are important to employees. And the prioritizing happens based on the amount of emotion attached to each of the issues that people describe. And I can tell you the only post hoc analysis really that we do with our responses sets is we take these emotion and issue and reason declarations, get an emotion and a reason for that, and we will code them by point of focus. So what is it that this person is referring to in the workplace? Are they referring to their recognition in the workplace? Are they referring to getting along with their peers? And we'll listen to these employees and respond with coding that reflects on what they're telling us about. And I can show you what this results in. And the next slide is a presentation of what it is that this particular group of employees can imagine for an idealized job. If the job was as good as it could be or ideal, I would have my life quality enhanced. I would feel like I was growing as a person. And by the way, the size of the bar then in each case is the amount of emotion that the whole group of employees attaches to that issue. So these are not employees, individual employees out to 1,000. These are emotion scoring points. And I also should mention that the survey has a built-in correction for emotions of the emotions being experienced by a respondent at the time they take the survey. So if you're happy today and you tell me you're happy about work, it doesn't mean as much in our system, in our correction factor, as if you're happy today and when you think about work, you're unhappy. It's dragging your emotions. To think about work is dragging your emotions away from your baseline quite a bit. So we feel that that's a more important response. So we have two other factors that we include in our algorithm, and the points then reflect how those aggregations are created. The highest expectation here, the largest expectation, is for life quality and growth. My work and contributing to the company, I want to feel like I'm doing something important. Getting along with my peers and my teammates, getting some recognition from the company, the leadership, compensation, and company and products, all of those should be positive, but they're almost like table stakes. They assume in an ideal job that those are all going to be good. The real benefit that they're looking for is personal. I want to feel my life quality is being enhanced and my work is contributing to the importance of the company or to the value that's being produced here. So you can see 98% positive emotions when people are thinking about an idealized job, which is certainly to be expected. Let's take a look on to the real. The next slide would show us the comparison. Well, first, let's take a look at the percent positive. Of course, percent positive emotions are very high for ideal. And in this case, what we found was that 30% of the emotions were actually negative. When I think about being at work, I feel negative. I feel badly. I feel unhappy, and so on. 60% positive. Some people are telling us that it's a good place to be, and they feel positively about it. And then there's about 10% of neutral. And when we compare those on these what we call floating bar charts on the next slide, you can see the whole group of employees are in the green. And they're not up against ideal. The profile here is quite different. You see a kind of a symmetrical pattern around the 0 point. So there was quite a bit of neutrality, as you saw before. There was some positivity, but there was certainly some negative emotions being expressed. So the tail ends of these off to the left are the presentations then of the negative and the negative emotions that people are having. This is the whole group. Now, this is helpful, but not as helpful as we need for it to be. So we segment these respondents into a segmentation strategy that we bring to the table. It's based on the amount of positive and negative emotion that each person feels. So we segment the group on the basis of how much positive or negative emotion they're feeling. And you can see how that falls out on the next slide. In this case, we had almost 50% positive. These are people now and not just emotions. So 50% of the people were positive about coming to work. Almost 22% were neutral, and fully 29% in this case, more than the 19 we might have predicted from the larger study done by Nielsen. But this group, very negative group, and I think we started to look then at who was positive and who was negative, and about half were attracted, and 1 out of 5 is neutral, and so on. So let's take a look then at the profile comparisons for these three groups. And the next slide then would show us, these are the satisfied folks. This is half the people in this company. And as we looked at the demographics, it turns out, as we might have predicted, of course, that this group of satisfied employees, almost on top of ideal. They really like their jobs. They're older Caucasian males who had been with the company for more than 10 years was a large percentage of this half, large component of satisfied employees were these folks from these demographic groups, older and Caucasian males. Then as we move down to the neutrals, and that's on the next slide, the neutral group consisted primarily of older women and employees who had been with the company less than 3 years. So we started to see less positivity in this group. They're coming to work, they're cashing their paychecks, and they had mixed feelings, some positive, some negative. But they were primarily, I think that you could look at this as these people are on board with the company, but they're not excited about being there. And finally, then the third group, these are the not satisfied people. And this is certainly the group that's giving rise to the very high attrition rates that were causing such problems for this company. 29%, almost 1 out of 3, turned out to be younger women and minorities who had been with the company for less than 3 years. This unhappy group described not feeling welcome or included in the company. They also described feeling resentment and overwhelmed by unequal workloads and being undertrained for their duties. So there was a group of employees who were running the show and had power in the organization. And then there was this fairly large group of people who were coming and going and not staying with the company because they weren't being treated well. And the next slide. As you can predict, this company had problems with attrition, women and minorities leaving within 6 months. To their credit, and this was very interesting to see this happen, but in our discussions of this data, the company stepped up and realized that this is a big business decision or a big business problem requiring a strong decision and a change. And they were nimble and they were aggressive in changing the environment at work. They set up a mentoring and training program for new hires. This all happened in about 2 or 3 months. They increased opportunities to interact with all company employees, new cafeteria and snack areas. The corporate sponsored picnics and athletic teams were increased. The cultural sensitivity trainings happened for all employees, and there were revised job performance and promotion rules put in place so that people had a chance to move up in the organization. So all of these changes came right out of the data. people were saying, I don't have adequate training and I don't know who to go to in this company for advice. And so they put together the mentoring program, and I don't know my fellow employees, and I don't know these people I'm supposed to work with very well, and so on. So there was just a clear map, a roadmap within the data describing what this company could do to improve. And they did those things. And this was, again, as I described to you, surprising to me. I've worked with many organizations, and many will get around to this stuff. This company jumped on it with both feet, and I was very surprised to see that they were able to do that as quickly as they did. And the next slide. Because of those aggressive changes, the survey-driven interventions resulted in 56% reduction in attrition and a 32% reduction in the size of the not satisfied group. So we had many fewer people telling us that they were unhappy about being at work. And this was only after 1 year. And this company continued with this and heard in the next 2 or 3 years that they had big improvements continuing throughout the organization. So I think what we can see happening here is the Ideal Insights provided a very clear understanding of what the people in the company wanted. When they walk in the door every morning, they want to be treated with respect. They want to feel like they're contributing. They want to feel like they're being fully adequately compensated. They want to feel all those things that you saw in the Ideal profile. And if you can provide those, you will move the dial in the right direction. And if you want to be able to attract women and minority groups, and you want to have a diverse workplace that is inclusive, you have to understand what it is that is happening in your workplace currently. How are people feeling when they walk in the door? Are we doing the right things to create an ideal for these folks? Are we delivering on their expectations? It just makes a whole lot of common sense here to realize that when we walk in and we have expectations and they're not met, we're not going to hang around, and we're certainly not going to be committed to the cause. So that's the real challenge, I think, facing employers, is understand what your employees want, and then to the best of your ability and within the power that you have and the capacity your company has, can you deliver an ideal experience to your workers? And with Glassdoor and Yelp out there, if people are unhappy, it's not going to be contained within your company. People are going to let others know on the internet how they feel about their jobs. And if you want to hire folks, everybody goes on the internet to look for a job, and they go to the Yelps and the Glassdoors, and they read about how employees really feel at work. And if you don't have a good reputation, 20, 30 years ago, you could get away with saying we're a great place to work and not doing that. But at this point, you really have to deliver on those expectations if you want to attract the best workers and retain them and keep them engaged. So I believe that we have a tool that you might find helpful, valuable information on where you stand. We can provide a baseline with an initial survey and have a conversation and discussion about what this data could turn into in terms of interventions. What could you do to improve? And then we can come back at some point in the future and see if you've been effective and successful in improving the quality of the workplace and the cultural climate. How does it feel for all of your employees to come to work? Are you disappointing some more than others, some demographics more than others? I guess you can probably see the value of this. And it's been a very interesting sequence over the years to do company after company and deliver this kind of information. We do also do surveys on how customers feel, what's their perception of the company. And as you can improve your image and your employee brand, you can also improve your customer brand with these same strategies. The Genera CEO finally came back and gave us a comment and said we knew we had an expensive, and here it is. It's a bottom line driven understanding that we better get this right. Expensive attrition problem. We did not realize that we were creating that many unhappy and disengaged employees. Clarity survey showed us what was going on and what we could do, and we're a much more positive company now, and our bottom line is starting to move because of it.